Fine. Welcome to the Canadian Records virtual meeting with the International Institute for Genealogical Studies, found at genealogicalstudies.com. My name is Drew von Hasselbach, and I'm a mentoring professor in the Canadian Records program offered by the Institute. This session, Headstones to Headlines, using Canadian newspapers in your research, is being recorded. So the obvious question, why should we study newspapers? Well, the obvious answer, they're filled with rich genealogical detail. We talk about BMD, the births, marriage, deaths. If you've done genealogy for a while, you're probably already using newspapers to find birth announcements, marriage announcements, death announcements, and so on. And if you're particularly lucky, you won't get just a death announcement, but you might find an obituary for your ancestor, and it'll have all sorts of biographical details about that person, when they migrated somewhere or what they did in perhaps a war, that sort of thing. Social notes, if you're familiar with especially community newspapers, the smaller community newspapers in smaller communities, you'll know that they're just filled with all sorts of neat little columns that tell you things like so and so visited with so and so last night. It's like they're the social media of their day. I mean, to our eyes, it looks very quaint and even kind of silly. But then I would always point out to people, if you see the sort of things that we put on our Facebook pages, you realize that, well, actually we do the same type of thing. So the social notes are really great because you get this sense of the slice of life, this a slice of life, what life was like for our ancestors. There'll also be lots of unexpected gems in there. You'll learn about accidents, which would be admittedly tragic. Lots of detail about migrations. I've come across this quite a bit. A lot of my family is from Ontario, Canada, and around the 1870s, 1880s, there was quite a migration of people from Ontario out to Western Canada because the railway had opened up and it was now possible to get to Western Canada, the area we now call the prairies, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and so on. So a lot of the Ontario newspapers had items about which families were moving out west, and that can be great, rich detail for your family history. Lots of gossip. Gossip can be a double-edged sword because you never know how reliable it is, but it can be fun to read. And that actually brings me to a point, and we're going to investigate this a little bit before we dive into a case study. The challenge with newspapers, and particularly historic newspapers, the kind of newspapers they had in the 19th century, is separating fact from fiction, separating direct knowledge from hearsay and gossip. So we got to be very careful. You need to learn how to read these things with a critical eye so that you can extract the information that's going to be truly valuable to you. Before we investigate that a bit, though, I think the most practical thing a lot of people would be looking for right away is, where am I going to find old newspapers? I don't want to get into this in too much detail because for one thing, I'm pretty sure that if you've been doing family research, you've figured out a few places to look. But a second thing, though, is that if I was to give you a list right now, by next week it might be out of date because there's so many newspapers that are starting to pop up online, historic collections and all sorts of archives and so on. So it'd be hard to give you a comprehensive uh, list. But here's some favorite sites that I do have. Number one would have to be Canadiana.ca. This is actually operated by well, it's not operated by, but it uses content supplied by the Library and Archives Canada. So the digitized collections of the Library and Archives Canada, which means it's not just newspapers. There's all kinds of material there, but a lot of newspapers, a lot of community newspapers from various parts of Canada, a lot from the Maritimes, actually. So you can really find a lot of information there. If you have ancestors from Ontario, which for those of you who are not from Ontario, that's our Canada. Ontario is by far the largest province in Canada by population. So there's a lot of people who lived here, and that means a lot of ancestors to be found here. There is a service called ourontario.ca, which is starting to accumulate links to lots of local archives that have digitized their local newspaper collection. So it's worth checking out. For those of you doing research in Quebec, si vous pouvez lire en français, you can go to the banque.qc.ca. That's the Bibliothèque et Archives nationales du Québec, I think is what that stands for. That is the Quebec archives, and their newspaper collection is fantastic. It's really easy to use, and it's fun to use. If you don't read French, um, eh, in this day and age, all the AI tools that you can access to help you read what the French articles say it can make it as if there's not another language that you're trying to penetrate, but a wonderful, rich collection there. One site that a lot of people don't know about is Google itself. So you probably know about Google Books and how Google had gone through several university libraries and digitized massive numbers of university library books and also public libraries and so on. Well, about the same time, they tried to do the same thing with newspapers. They started digitizing all these old newspaper collections. It was a project, though, that they abandoned. So they never completed. However, the newspapers that did get digitized are still there. They're still online, and there's quite a few from Canada. Ottawa Citizen, for example. You can find all sorts of old copies of the Ottawa Citizen, and it's just as easy to use as using Google. Um, Internet Archive, archive.org is the URL. You could definitely use that as a site where you can start your search. One of the reasons that I put this in the list and I pointed out to you is that for a lot of archives, what they're actually doing is they're not hosting their digitized collections on site within the archives, but they're actually putting it on the archive.org servers, wherever they are, so that archive.org is actually hosting that material. So even though you might land on, say, a local archives site, or we're going to see the Peel collection from the University of Alberta's got a huge collection of Canadian newspapers on it. That used to be hosted by the University of Alberta itself. They're now migrating, and I think they've almost finished doing this. They've migrated that collection over to archive.org. If you have the means to pay for them, there are for pay services such as newspapers.com and oldnews.com. I mentioned those two because newspapers.com is affiliated with ancestry.com, and oldnews.com, which is relatively new, is affiliated with myheritage.com. So those two sites work in concert with two of the bigger genealogy websites. I use newspapers.com quite a bit, but it's not cheap. So definitely, if you can find a way to access information using one of the free sites, that's going to make a lot more sense in your research. Now, that's for digitized stuff. That's for online stuff. And I figure most of us probably want that. We want to be doing that research from home. If you do have the time and the means to get yourself to an archives or a library, definitely all the provincial archives in Canada have significant newspaper collections. The one at the Ontario Archives is massive. It's all on microfilm and it's really easy to use. What I would actually tell you, and this is my number one tip when it comes to searching for a newspaper that might be relevant to your research, start local. So go to that local library, go to that local library's website, go to that local archives, not the provincial archives, but I'm talking like the county level archives or the municipal archives. Check out their website, give the archivist a call, ask them what they have in their collection, because the odds are that when you're looking for something that's hyper local, it's more likely going to be in that local archives than it is going to be in a provincial level or even a national level archives. I've discovered this numerous times over. It's the best way to find those local papers. There may well come a day. I mean, we're still in the early days of digitization. Really, we're still in the early days of the internet when you really think about it. So, by the end of this century, and if my great grandson is watching me, hello, great grandson. Um, I hope it's great that you can just look at your watch and read the newspaper from my time and find out what I was up to. That stuff may well be completely digitized by that time, but for this day and age, you still want to be thinking about visiting physical archives to look at for some information. Universities have lots of this material. I mean, for the obvious reasons, like history departments want to be able to access some of this material. I had mentioned the University of Alberta. The Peel collection is fantastic for genealogy and local history. It's not just newspapers. They have a lot of newspapers available, but they've also digitized all those history books. Those if you're familiar with Little Towns in the Prairies, like every one of them has a local history book where all the people in the community contributed and wrote the stories of their families, and you can find all that stuff in the Peel archives. Um, uh, I can go on. The Nova Scotia archives, I think there's about 24 really solid newspaper collections there. There's just all kinds of material in those provincial archives. Of course, granddaddy of them all, if you have the capacity to get to Ottawa, nobody has a bigger newspaper collection than the Library and Archives of Canada. But like I said, start local before you have to make a trip to Ottawa to search the collection there. Okay, now I alluded to this, and we got to talk about this. It's kind of the elephant in the room of newspaper research. Is a newspaper account a reliable genealogical source? Now, one thing I got to say, I don't know what you know about me, but I was a newspaper reporter for nearly 30 years. I was a journalist for 32 years. I worked at major daily newspapers for, I think it was 26. Um, So to me, I think of newspapers as, as good as it gets when it comes to telling you like it is. Well, I know not everybody's of that opinion about media these days. And it's certainly the case that when it comes to material from the 19th century, we got to be a little careful in what we're discovering. Now, for those of you who are students at the International Institute of Genealogical Studies, when you do your methodology courses, you will see this. This is the evidence map as produced by Elizabeth Schoen Mills. And it's a little table that shows us how, as genealogists, we should be examining evidence. We think about sources, the containers of information. We think about the information itself. In other words, who provided that information, and then looking at that source and that information, we weigh the value of that evidence. We look at whether it's direct evidence that answers our questions or it's indirect evidence that might uh, answer a question like, well, for example, if you're looking for somebody, if you believe somebody died in 1879 and they're not in the census in 1881, well, that gives you, that's indirect evidence that that person's passed away. It's also negative evidence that might prove your point. So those are ways we assess evidence. Now let's look at newspapers and let's ask ourselves a couple of questions. So what kind of source is a newspaper? Now we might think, well, it's an original source, right? Like the reporters went off and they collected information and they wrote, stories about things that were happening right away. That can be true, but the problem with a lot of 19th century era newspapers is we don't really know. It really depends on the material that's in the newspaper, and there'll be a wide variety of material in that newspaper. There can be authored accounts, like eyewitness accounts by the reporters who saw some event and wrote about it, or it could be material that was just passed along to that newspaper in the mail or by a wire service, or a lot of back in those days, A newspaper editor would see somebody else's newspaper and see an article and like it and just put it in their own paper. Like we don't really know where this information came from because they didn't use a lot of bylines. They didn't actually specify where they were finding information. Um, and we have to look at the nature of the what we can call the article or the report itself. Um, Something like a birth announcement is probably placed by the parents, and so the parents would know what's going on with that child, and they would be, they would have direct firsthand knowledge of things. So that might be quite reliable information, but something that sounds like it's just some gossip, like mention of a birth in a local gossip column, might not be as reliable. So what are we going to do? Well, we just want to keep in mind the difference between primary and secondary information, right? So primary information, firsthand accounts provided by eyewitnesses to the events that are described. Um, we hope that those events are being discussed and reported contemporaneous with the events that they describe, right? So um, not like recollections from 3 decades later, but like if a child is born on the Tuesday, the report in the paper's on the Thursday, and that's, you know, quite current. Um, so, birth announcements placed by parents quite soon after the birth of a child, marriage notices that appear in the newspaper, within a week or two after the wedding, those can be quite reliable. But watch out for secondary information. And the problem is, you're not going to know. You're not going to know whether that report was, passed along secondhand as hearsay, or whether that information is coming from the person with the firsthand knowledge of the information. So you got to watch out for hearsay, secondhand reports. Um, well, you also got to realize that even when you're dealing with like something like one of those local columns that sums up social notes, well, that information is being filtered by the person who prepared that column. So they might actually misunderstand some information that's passed to them, or they might make an error in what they write up. So you got to be careful about that. Um, and one thing you really got to watch out for, I would say, as much as I love obituaries because they give us a story about that person's life, a lot of that information is coming to whoever wrote the obituary secondhand, particularly like anything to do with the birth of that individual. The person who wrote that, let's say the son of someone writes the obituary. Well, obviously that son was not present at the birth of his own father, right? So that information is going to be secondhand. So just you got to keep that stuff in mind. Um, we also in genealogy, we also talk about undetermined information. Okay, so we encounter this a lot in census records because we don't know who provided the information in the census returns. And in newspapers, that's happening all the time. We don't actually know where the information is coming from. So just a lot of things that we have to be careful careful about. And if we sum it all up like this, ask yourself these questions before you rely on something you see in a newspaper. Who supplied the information? How soon did that article or that report appear in the paper after the event that it's supposed to describe? Don't rely solely on that information from the paper. Make sure you're corroborating that information by finding other sources. So, if it's a birth announcement, try and find the birth registration. If it's an obituary, try and find the death registration. And you can, keep your spidey senses tingling for words like likely, recently, anything that suggests some subjectivity as to the information. So that gives you a bit of a theoretical framework, but you're not here to learn about theory. You're here to read about newspapers and maybe encounter an actual headstone taken to a headline. And that's what we're going to do here. A headstone to a headline. Well, if you visit Find a Grave, you can find lots of images of headstones. So here's one that I found just the other day. This is from a cemetery in Stratford, Ontario. It's for James Ballantyne. Now, not a relative of mine. I just was looking for an example, and I think I found a good one. So this ancestor, he's buried, or this person, this individual, he's buried in Avondale Cemetery, Stratford, Ontario. Let's take a close look at the headstone. Let's see what the headstone tells us. And I think I can make that a little bigger. Yeah. Okay. So there's a B at the top. Looks like the B for, I don't know if you see the Bitcoin B, but that looks like a B, B for Ballantyne. And then it says James, son of Robert and Agnes Ballantyne, died. This might be hard for you to read, but it says died October 28th, 1889, aged 44 years. So right away, I'm saying, okay, 44 years, not a ripe old age for somebody. So there might be a story behind this. Of course, there's more information there. We can see some information about his wife, who lived until she was 61, so she, lived much longer. So something interesting must have happened here. And if we want to find out what that something interesting is, where might we look? Well, I would say the local paper. So the place to go is the Stratford Perth Archives, and not in person. You can do this online. They digitized their newspaper collection there just a couple of years ago. You can see on this slide, you'll see down in the lower right corner there, you can see there's the digitized newspaper database. It's very simple to use. You click on there, it takes you to the newspaper collection. And recall that James Ballantyne died 1889, so we're looking for a newspaper from 1889. In fact, he died on the 28th of October, 1889, according to his tombstone. So we want to find a newspaper from close to that date. Now, we find the Stratford Times in the collection. Now, you'll see that the Stratford Times was actually weekly. So there's only going to be one paper a week. You want to find the first paper after the event that took place, because it would be something else if they published an article about James's death the week before he actually passed away. That would actually be rather suspect, I would think. But anyway, the 30th of October, 1889, that's the first edition that appears after the date on the tombstone. Here's another tip I'm going to give you. Ordinarily, we would look at a newspaper and we'd start at the front page. Well, when you're looking for death announcements, you actually want to go to the back. And why would I say that? Well, it's the way papers were physically manufactured. They actually, for a weekly paper, for example, they would print the middle pages in the middle of the week, because that would contain information that had shelf life. Things like, recipes or serialized novels, that sort of stuff. The actual news they saved for the front page, page 2, which is the other side of the front page, and the back page and the page before the back page. So in this case, it was an 8-page paper. So page 1 and 2 would have breaking news on it, and 7 and 8 would have breaking news on it. Well, what counts as breaking news? Death, birth, and marriage announcements, because nobody can predict when those things are going to happen. So if I go to the back page, this is page 8, the final page of the paper. Right away, I could see there's a births, marriages, and deaths column, a BMD column. And right there, there's the deaths, and the first death that is mentioned is Ballantyne. And it says accidentally killed at his residence, Langside, Downey. Downey is a township in Perth County, not far from Stratford, on the 28th inst. That's a short form you're going to see in a lot of 19th century papers. Instant means instant. In other words, that day this month, right? So this paper came out on the 30th of October. The 28th inst was the 28th of the current month. If it said 28th ultimo or ult, that would mean the prior month, which would have been September. So the 28th inst means it happened on the 20th of October. We learn his name, Mr. James Ballantyne, aged 44 years. And then we get some funeral information. Funeral today. So that was a Wednesday. at 1 o'clock. And you'll often see this construction from his late residence to Avondale Cemetery. So they would have the funeral at a location. It could be a church, a chapel, or this individual's, in this case, this individual's house. And then there'd be a procession to the cemetery for the actual interment ceremony. So this tells us that he was buried in Avondale Cemetery, which makes sense because that's where we found his tombstone. But you know, we're doing family history, and part of the word history is the word story. So we want to find more about the actual story. And accidentally, well, I want to know a little bit more about what happened. So there must be more to the story. Uh, and here's another tip. Now, I told you to go to the back page to read about the death announcements and so on, but that doesn't mean when you're done that, throw the paper aside. You still want to read the whole paper because there might be other sources, there might be other articles about this event in the paper. And in this case, right there on the front page in the bottom left-hand corner, there is a story. From the headstone to the headline is Fatal Accident. And we learn that Mr. James Ballantyne fell from a stable loft and was instantly killed. It's kind of a gruesome way to go. So the people in town were shocked by this news. We actually see that this happened on the, oh, I see. People found out about it on the 29th, although the incident had taken place the day before on the 28th. Yeah, he fell from this stable loft to his instant death. And what happened, it was around 8 o'clock on a Monday night. And in some manner unknown, that's that subjectivity thing we got to watch out for. Some manner unknown, it is thought, so whoever wrote this didn't actually know what happened. They're just trying to piece together what happened. It is thought he stepped backward and fell through an open window onto the graveled ground outside, a distance of 28 feet. Some details about what happened to him when he fell, which are kind of gruesome. And it says he died a few minutes after the accident. The old editor and me might say, well, you said he was killed instantly and he didn't die instantly. So it strikes me as a contradiction, but really I'm not going to quibble over that for the purposes of family history. We do learn that he was 44 years old. And this is actually where it becomes quite poignant and special because we learn quite a bit about this man's standing in the community. He was one of the best known and most highly respected farmers of Downey, that township, having always taken a lively interest in public matters. He last year filled the position of president of the North Perth Agricultural Society, probably a prominent role back then. He was the nephew of Thomas Ballantyne, Esquire, MPP for South Perth, so kind of almost an establishment figure in his community. His sad death has caused a feeling of profound regret throughout the whole community. He leaves a wife and 2 children to mourn the loss of a kind husband and father. So some details there. If you're just beginning this research, you know right away, not only is there a widow, there's 2 children. His remains will be interred in Avondale Cemetery today, Wednesday at 1 o'clock p.m. So as I had said, don't just end your research by finding something in a births, marriages, and deaths column. Make sure you scan the entire paper because there might be another article that provides a lot more information about what's going on. So that's one tip. A second tip, however you're saving your information, whether you're doing screen captures, that sort of thing, make sure you take detailed notes as to where you found the article. It's standard genealogical practice to include a citation. What's a good citation? A good citation is something that would enable somebody else to find that information in fairly rapid order. So the citation I used here is I used the headline of the article, Fatal Accident. I said which newspaper it was in, the Stratford Times. I provided the date, the 30th of October, 1889. This is down in the bottom left corner, if you're wondering what I'm talking about. And I have a habit of saying at page one, at page two. This is you don't have to use the word at. It's an old thing that I learned to do um, in um, at university. But some people might use it like have the date and then say a colon and then the page number. It doesn't matter as long as you tell people what page you found the information on. Now, very important in this day and age, I included the URL where I found the story. Um, and I also said when I accessed the information, which was yesterday, I believe. Why do I do that? Because there's no guarantee that 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, that URL will still be active and still bring somebody to that story. Anyway, that tells us what happened to James Ballantyne. Are we done? No, we are not done because I said we should always try to corroborate the information. Well, one thing we know, or if, if you do research in Ontario, you'll know Ontario has a very robust civil registration system that starts around 1869. It's freely available on familysearch.org. You can also find it on ancestry.com. You can go to the Archives of Ontario and find this information on microfilm. It's fairly easy to locate this stuff. And the death registrations have a lot of information in them. And in this particular case, I found James Ballantyne, his death registration. It says that he died on the 30th of October, which probably is not correct because we saw a newspaper that's sold on the 30th of October might have been printed the day before, right? So um, this is a rare instance where the registration might actually have a flaw in it. It says how old he was. He says he was a farmer. He says he was from Downey, Ontario. Um, the explanation of the death here is a little different from the account that you got in the newspaper. It says accidentally killed by falling from door in gable end of barn. And I can't, it looks like it says vault barn. I'm not as up to speed in my 19th century farming vocabulary as perhaps I'd like to be. Um, I thought it might say bulk barn, but I think it says vault barn. I can't really read the handwriting, but this information was supplied by a doctor. Um, a takeaway from that for somebody who wants to do even more research, because this was an accidental death, it's possible there was a coroner's inquest. Um, I took a quick look and I didn't see any information that there was. But if you ever do come across a coroner's inquest report, you'll find that they're quite incredible sources of information. More than that, they include all these eyewitness accounts that are signed by those witnesses. And in a case that involves a direct ancestor of mine, the only time I've seen my great-great-grandmother's handwriting is the X she made after she gave some evidence in a coroner's inquest. So kind of special. Um, anyway, we find out who provided this information, who was the informant. Always key. Who was the informant? Well, it was Robert Ballantyne, who was actually the father of James. And yeah, so we corroborated that. So look at the takeaways. What did I do? I took you through a theoretical framework in which to approach your newspaper research. I told you some places you can find newspapers. And then I took you through the process whereby I started with a headstone and I found articles in the newspaper that explained what had happened to the person in the headstone. And then we corroborated that using a civil death registration. So what does that mean? Well, the newspaper was crucial in all this, but we treated the newspaper as clues, as a contributing source of information, not the sole repository, the sole source of the facts around this case. You do have to evaluate who, when, where, and how that information was recorded. Recall that when I was reading the story, I was commenting on some of the language in there that was a little speculative. Looks like he might have backed up and fallen out of the the window. The author of that article didn't actually know for certain what had transpired. You want to remember to corroborate those newspaper accounts by reaching outside and finding evidence of from other sources that you can rely on. But none of that is to dissuade you from using papers. I mean, there are such rich, wonderful sources of color that give you context for your ancestry, your ancestors' history. And I can't say this enough. Start local, and when you find an article in a paper, make sure you read the whole paper. Don't just satisfy yourself that you found the one article that you think is relevant to you and leave it at that. So that is my walk through Canadian newspapers. And now keep in mind that we're still recording this. So if you'd like to ask some questions and would prefer to ask questions after we finish the recording, I can do that. But if anybody would like to ask a question right now, you are more than welcome to do so. Okay, well, I had fun and I hope you did too. Don't forget to check out some of our other videos on YouTube. Give this video a like, leave a comment, and smash that subscriber button. Our next Canadian Virtual Records meeting will be Wednesday, October 15th. International Institute of Genealogical Studies students can catch it live at 7 p.m. ET, or perhaps we'll see you again here live on YouTube. Our topic for that meeting: bequeath it or not, why our ancestors left $1 bequests in wills. Thank you for joining us. For more information or to learn about a career as a professional genealogist, visit us at genealogicalstudies.com.